To the young people in the audience, if you're a student, whether that's in elementary school, in high school, or university, and I know we have all of those ages covered here, I do want to just say this. One of the benefits to what we're doing is that because you live in a world that seems to say that you can believe in science or the Bible if you want, but not both, one of the advantages that I see to having a conference like this is that you can see good science, good scientists, highly intelligent people who are experts in their particular field of science who do believe that the Bible is true. And so you stand in good company. By the way, if you do any history of many of the scientists that you read about and study about in school, you will know that they too, many of them believe the Bible was true as well. So we are looking forward to our next session here. I do want to just say this. When I talked to Kirk about this conference and was pitching some ideas to him about a year ago, we were talking and I said, oh, I'd love to have another scientist there. And Kirk was the one who suggested Marcus. He said, have you heard of Marcus Ross? I was like, the name sounds familiar, but it just wasn't coming. So he sent me some stuff, and then when I did a little research, I went, oh, that's right. We had just shown at the chapel the movie Is Genesis History? And Marcus is one of the guys who is featured in that film. And so Marcus is a paleontologist. Who knows what a paleontologist is? What's a paleontologist? Is that right? That works. Someone who looks at dinosaur bones. So if you have questions about dinosaurs or rocks, and anytime I talk to young people in the area of science, almost always dinosaurs comes up. Marcus is happy to answer your questions. That's his master's degree and his doctorate degree in paleontology. So you will want to talk to him or submit your questions through Instagram and Facebook. Put your comments there and we can do that during our panel discussion here too. Dr. Marcus Ross is a professor of geology at Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia, where he serves as the director for the Center for Creation Studies. And as I mentioned, he was in the recent movie documentary Is Genesis History, where he spoke with the host Del Tackett about how the fossil record supports the biblical description of creation. Marcus holds a Master of Science degree in paleontology and earned a PhD in geosciences from the University of Rhode Island. Given his training and expertise in this field, he is qualified to speak to us about the geological evidence for a worldwide flood in the days of Noah as described in the Bible. Would you please give a good, warm Canadian welcome to Dr. Marcus Ross.
Well, thanks for letting the Yank from the States come on up here in Canada. This is my third trip to Canada over the course of my life. I do have some, about a quarter French Canuck in me, so vive la Québécois. And a couple of you can see up here that I'm barefoot. The reason for that is because I'm trying to establish my Canadian bona fides by saying I can handle the cold. No, I actually enjoy going barefoot most places. I view shoes a lot like most people look at gloves, and so I don't wear shoes very frequently. However, snow is a good reason why the Lord gave us a brain to create things like shoes. So I wear my flip-flops. Those are kind of like my slippers. If I want to stay nice and warm, I just throw on a pair of flips and I kind of go. So that's just to say I'm standing on holy ground. I don't know what's wrong with the rest of y'all. I'm also working on my southern. I grew up in Rhode Island in the Northeast, but I teach at Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia. As Brian mentioned, my background is in paleontology. I was a fossil geek from age 4. And ever since I was a little kid and I first learned about dinosaurs, I wanted to learn everything I could about them. I also came to faith at a very early age, and it was about the time that I was 9 that I distinctly remember sitting in a room in my house and thinking, what do I do with the Bible and the dinosaur books? Because they're not telling me the same thing. They're not telling me the same history of this world. And as a rational little kid, not always rational, right? But still thinking there's one history to this world. There aren't multiple histories to this world. And so how do I make sense of that? And I remember thinking about theological options, and I didn't have any of the terms or the special concepts in theology for this sort of thing, but I was thinking, you know, were the days really long, or did God create before the 6 days in creation week? I was thinking ideas like gap theory, day age, etc., in the context of this little 9-year-old, which tells me one thing, you know, I was weird. But as I now am married and have kids of my own who are entering into that age, I realized I wasn't as weird as what I thought, because kids have to think about these things, and they do think about these things. And I dedicated my life to this point, studying paleontology and dinosaurs and fossils and those types of issues. And I was a young Earth creationist in an environment that was not ever supportive of that view. I went to state public schools, I went to state university, state master's, state PhD work. I was never in an environment that fostered a robust evaluation of the statements of the Bible concerning Earth history and considered them to be part of the evidence base, even though I did, and I never had anybody come alongside who was in my program and say, yeah, I agree with you. So that has given me a bit of an interesting perspective on things, because there wasn't a place to kind of go and be a creation geologist. It was just be a geologist. And so what I want to talk to you about today is some of the arguments and the evidence that I think are potent here for understanding natural history of the world, and that single history of the world, with reference to Noah's flood. So this title the title for this is Noah's Flood, where Scripture meets geology. So I teach at Liberty University, and you also see this Cornerstone Educational Supply. That's a company my wife and I started 4 years ago to provide science materials for Christian schools, home educators, and others who might want to learn about rocks and fossils, and so we make our own kits and things like that. It's in the States, so I heard the exchange rate's a little rough right now, but we're not shipping in Canada. But if somebody's a business partner and wannabe, talk to me later. No, we'll move on here. But a passion for me has always been education, whether it's educating college students or educating kids in kindergarten. Let them see the world, let them hold and touch the things that God has made, and let us come and reason together. So what I'm going to give here is part of a presentation from a textbook that I co-authored with several other creation geologists and scientists. The title of the book is called The Heavens and the Earth. We published it just a couple of years ago in 2015 and 16. And it's the textbook that we use at Liberty University, where I teach for earth science and geology. It's used at Cedarville University in Ohio. It's used at several other Christian colleges around the country, Master's College, etc. So what you're going to be getting here is actually the last part of this chapter that first deals with plate tectonics generally and lays out the arguments for moving plates and continents. And the last part of the chapter says, okay, if the plates are moving, how do we understand that in the context of a biblical Earth history? So our views about Noah's Ark and the flood are heavily influenced by the experiences and the images that we have as we grow up, right? If you just close your eyes for a moment, you think of Noah's Ark, it's probably going to look something like that. Which is cute and adorable and rather unfortunate all at the same time. Right? Because Noah's Ark usually looks like Africa meets a boat. Right? You've got your hippos, good. You've got your giraffes, because you always need a couple of those. You got some lions, and okay, we got some kangaroos, so there's an Australian contingent on board. Right? We've got all these critters that, one, are very modern looking. They're the animals we're familiar with that get up on the boat. And apparently Noah is, I don't know, Amish or something. I really wish I had this. They don't make this anymore. One of the things that at least is good about this particular ark is that all the animals actually fit in. The problem is you have to lay them sideways and stack them in order for that to work, which is probably not the way that it worked really back then. And I've never seen a parrot that is that large in comparison to a lion. That's frightening. Maybe it's one of the velociraptors. Anyway, so the unfortunate thing is we often have something like this as our first thought on Noah's Ark. Little boat, African animals, modern world. We need to disabuse ourselves of that. And so what we need to do first to disabuse ourselves of that idea is to go back to the scripture itself. I'm not going to be talking about the size and the dimensions and the cargo of Noah's Ark here. That's looking at geology instead. But that little boat's not going to survive what we're about to explore and discover about the way that the flood worked. And the good news is it didn't have to, because that little boat is not what's written in the pages of Scripture. It's not there at all. So I don't want to be the Ark police at your church. I will be, if you need that. But at the same time, we need to get ourselves oriented correctly on this. So when we take a look at the biblical narrative that describes the events of what we call Noah's flood, the Hebrew word for this is the word mabul. It is a word that is used exclusively for this event in the Old Testament. It is not used for anything else. This is not the typical Hebrew word for flood. If the Nile or the Tigris is flooding, it is not a mabul. Mabul is something entirely different. In fact, one of the Hebrew scholars at my school, Dr. Harvey Hartman, went back through this and looked at something for me. He said, in fact, not only is this the only word that's used, but every single time it is used in the Old Testament, the Hebrew article ha is in front of it, which is the. So it's not just a mabul, it's the mabul. It is a titled event in every instance in which it's described in Scripture. So it tells us that this is a unique event. It's unlike anything else that's there. The Greek word, when the Old Testament was translated into Greek for the Septuagint, or when this event is discussed in the New Testament by New Testament authors such as Peter, they use the Greek word cataclysmos for this. And cataclysmos, likewise, is not the Greek word for a flood. We get the English word cataclysm by just transposing this into English. But the idea here is that we have a massively destructive event that includes water, but is actually so much more than that. So these terms are telling us something, that the events involve water, but it's more than that. This is world destructive and also not simply a localized event. We'll kind of follow how that came to be. So the other thing that Sunday school unfortunately gets in our head is that we know that Noah's flood lasts 40 days and 40 nights. And that's not true either. Noah's flood is bigger than that, but the Lord said to Noah, there's going to be a floody. I hate that song. I hate that song with a deep and abiding passion. And I tell my students that I hate that song, and they laugh. But they know it, right? Because they learned it at camp, and they learned it at Sunday school, and things like that. But can you imagine singing a song with that kind of cute little thing about the destruction of the World Trade Center towers in 2001? Would you sing a happy little song about the death of 250,000 people in Indonesia in 2004 because there was a tsunami that came and killed loved ones? That's the event that the biblical narrative is describing to us. It is a worldwide destruction of absolutely every single human being and land-dwelling, air-breathing animal on the face of the earth. And so the Lord did not say to Noah, there's going to be a floody. The Lord told Noah there was going to be death to the world, and that you must prepare because you've been righteous in my sight. We need to teach this event for what it is. And yes, I understand we want kids to have cute things and to think the Bible is telling it, but it's not just a story involving a bunch of cute animals. Our kids need to learn, because they can handle it, that God is talking about judgment, His willingness to judge the world. The waters prevail over the world for 150 days. This is a military term in the Hebrew. When the Israelite army prevails over the Philistines, same word is being used here. So this is a term of aggression, that the waters are overwhelming the forces of land, for example. We have 224 days from the time Noah gets on board the ark to the time that he finally sees the first mountaintops. And there's not much of those yet either. He still has to wait. We end up with 371 days for the total duration of the flood. We get 40 days and 40 nights because we read it and then we get bored with the numbers, right? Because it's in the 8th month and the 7th day and 7th, this sort of thing. We don't use that type of calendar writing, so maybe you need to read the Message. Maybe it fixes that. I don't know. I haven't checked, but instead we have to kind of tally this all up, and you find out that in Noah's 600th year, in the 2nd month, the 7th day of the month, so let's say it's February 7th, that's when the flood initiates and starts. And it's not until a year and a half later, in the end of February, that the flood is done and Noah exits with the people. So this is a big event. This isn't 40 days and 40 nights of rain. This is a year of catastrophe and calamity. Now, how do we know that? When we take a look at the Bible, we see that there are over 60 instances of the words all and every, or what are translated all, every, everything in the Bible. And so this is not hyperbole, this is emphasis. And I know you can't see that from where you're at, but I went through and looked at Genesis 6 through 9 and circled in red each of the instances of all and every and everything, all flesh and that sort of thing. And it's a lot. There's only one area, it's actually just underneath here, where you don't see it used consistently and continuously. And the reason that you don't see it in that paragraph in the middle is because that's when the waters finally start to drain. And everything is not underwater, and everything has not been destroyed, and everything is not dying, and everything's not under more water. But we see a lot of it before. God's promising He will destroy it all. Then it does get destroyed. Then the waters start to peel back after God's command. And then there's a whole series of every and everything where God enacts a covenant with Noah and his family and the animals that have left the ark. And He promises that this will never happen again. And He's making this promise to every creature and everything that has the breath of life. So this is your mom talking, right? We, as especially younger kids, have trouble remembering things. And as older folks, we have trouble remembering things too, right? But your mom reminded you over and over again to make your bed or take out the trash, right? She said this all the time. And it's not, she wasn't being hyperbolic about it. I want you to take the trash out every day. No, take the trash out every single day. Hebrews used repetition for emphasis because they didn't have PowerPoint with bullets and flashing stuff. And praise the Lord, there were no emoticons and emojis in the Bible at that time. Okay, so we start with something like Genesis chapter 6, 7, 8, and 9, the passages that encapsulate the flood event. But this is not the only place where it is discussed. Every other instance in the Old Testament, particularly in the Psalms and in the New Testament with the sayings of Jesus, the writings of Peter, etc., all reinforce that this was an event that completely enveloped the world and resulted in only 8 people being saved through that water. Noah, his wife, the 3 sons, and their 3 wives. And if you weren't on the boat, where were you? You were dead. You were dead. Outside of the crucifixion accounts in which human beings killed their Lord and Savior, Genesis chapter 7 is the worst chapter in the entire Bible. It really is the worst. And we get to explore that through science, which is kind of strange. Because that event, and I was just talking with Dr. Durston, that science studies events. And miracles, such as some of the water turning to wine, is an event. And while we can't penetrate and discover exactly how a miraculous activity occurred, if God is manipulating space and time to His own will to do something like change H2O into a whole huge complex of stuff that I can't drink because I work at Liberty. Anyway, right? This whole complex system is brought forth in a moment's time. I can't study what God did there as far as the mechanism, but I can say that somebody else tasted the wine and it was really good. The evidence was there. And so when we look at something like Noah's flood, we have the evidence surrounding us in the rocks of the world. And from that, we might be able to even reconstruct some of the events. But it's going to be in the more speculative area of science. This is inferential science. I talk about similar types of distinction in my class because geology is forensics. It's forensics on the planet. And the trouble is that the further that you get away from the actual event in time, and the fewer witnesses that you have to those events, and the less data that you have left over, the more tentative our conclusions about this have to be. We enter into a little bit more story mode, but hopefully what we're going to do is create a story that is based on the evidence that makes the most sense of that inference to the best explanation. That's what we get to do in the historical sciences of geology and paleontology. We're working backwards from the evidence that we have to try and reconstruct what occurred. We could be wrong, absolutely, could certainly be wrong, but hopefully we're more right than wrong as we go through. So I would submit that what we have when we're looking at the geological record is we have a choice to make. two options, really. One is that this geological record of all the rocks and the fossils that are found within them is a record of recent creation and the flood, or it's a record of billions of years of development and life on Earth. There's pretty much only two options, at least, contemporarily. You've got people who are effectively young Earth creationists, like myself, and you have folks that think that the Earth is tremendously ancient. Now, within that, you have a wide variety of different opinions. Maybe God was creating things over time directly. Maybe God was guiding an evolutionary process. Maybe God was not involved in an evolutionary process. But as far as the time scales go, there's kind of two options. This one's right, or that one's right, or everybody's wrong and nobody knows what's going on. Those are kind of what we've got. So I hope you were able to pick up one of the time scales on your way back in. There's a little card that we put in our textbook and also that I use with my company. And this is a simplified version. If you didn't get one of the little time scales, they'll be out on the welcome table when you take your break here coming up at 12. Also, Brian said that I can speak till 12, but he didn't qualify that with PM or AM, so I've got some time. So we're looking at the same exact data. We are looking at the rocks, and there's actually very big agreement about the rocks in terms of their at least relative position to one another. There are some rocks that are above others and below others. Certain fossils are found only within these rocks and not found within these other ones, and geologists have worked over centuries to try and work out what we call the geological timeline, or the geological scale. And on a relative fashion, I'm in perfect agreement with all of the colleagues who trained me that there are dinosaur fossils that are found above rocks that have trilobite fossils. And I have not, in my life, ever seen a rock that contained both trilobites and dinosaurs. That is a piece of evidence, that is a verifiably, experimentally verifiable type of statement, because you can go out to more rock outcrops, you can hit them with hammers and look at the fossils you have and see if the pattern continues to hold. And it does. And in the Cenozoic, you've got mostly mammal fossils and things like that. And draped over all top of that is glacial debris, and that you can find quite a bit of that over here as the glaciers came through this area. The lake right nearby us, scoured out by a glacier. So the question then is, when did the events that buried the dinosaurs and the trilobites or were involved in the Ice Age, when did those happen? In a relative fashion, we agree, but in the ultimate timeline, we're looking at either thousands of years ago or billions of years ago, right? So we've got the same rocks, and we have to understand what is the timeline between the two of them. So our two questions for the flood, and let me go back here for just a moment. In the history of geology, it started off in the 16 and 1700s with the early pioneering geologists, people like Nico Steno from Denmark working in Italy, looking at these rocks and saying that there were rocks that were formed by Noah's flood, there were rocks that were formed during creation week before that, and there were some rocks that were probably formed after the flood was done. The very first geologist, Nico Steno, who put together a consistent, kind of coherent picture of the history of geology in one area, was doing so within a specifically Christian and young Earth creationist framework. His book called Prodromos lays this out very specifically. And everybody liked it. Everybody thought it was great. But by the time we get to the 1700s, there's a group of geologists who are looking at the rocks and saying, I don't think that we can put all of this stuff in the flood. I think we're finding evidence of animals that used to live and exist that we don't have around with us today. They were grappling with the idea of extinction. And as a result, they started adding time and pushing the flood higher and higher up through here. And by the time we get to the early mid-1800s, around the 1830s or so, the flood had been pushed all the way up here, and then people discovered that there was an ice age that created the gravels and the sands and the other deposits, and then the flood went away from the history of geology. It disappeared at that point, about 1840. And so what I would submit is that the geologists were making a mistake by saying extinction means that there were ancient worlds before humanity. Extinction simply means that there were creatures that lived in the past that we don't have with us in the future, but they were coming to grips with this concept of extinction for the very first time. Right? And we take for granted extinction because we watch nature shows, we can go to museums and see the fossils and stuff like that, but they were trying to figure out and wrestle with this within a Christian context, trying to have a robust reading of Genesis, and that's when you see the development of ideas like day age and gap theory first come on board the scene in 1802, 1808. These ideas to try to retain a meaningful history to Genesis within the context of an ancient earth are very new theological positions in the history of Christianity. They're only a couple of hundred years old. What I would say, though, is that they missed the forest for the trees. They kept trying to explain things from worlds before, where really the flood is going to be able to explain why we have these rocks. Now, sooner or later, there's an end to the flood, and creation geologists and my colleagues get to argue about the boundaries and where they are, and that's all our kind of geek, and egghead kind of argumentation. But we can all agree within young Earth creationism that there are creation week rocks, flood rocks, and post-flood rocks. Now, if there are rocks that are made from the flood, then we have to answer some questions about the flood. And with my apologies to those who are grammarians and English majors here, from whence did the waters come? But let's be real, right? Where did the water come from and where did it go? How did we get water to flood the world? What did God, did God just make new water and did he just take it away? Or did he use the earth in a different sort of fashion? And God says at the beginning of Genesis chapter 6 that I will destroy the earth with the earth. It seems like God is saying he's going to use the planet to rip itself to shreds. Okay, that's interesting. So I would submit that the flood is essentially a geological and tectonic event, and that it's tectonic movements, the movements of our plates, that are going to answer the question of where the water came from and where the water went. So that gets us into geology. This is where we start delving into the meat of our talk here. The lithosphere is a term geologists have for the uppermost units of rock that include our crust and a little bit of the mantle of the earth. The mantle is the next unit down. It's actually the biggest. It makes up over 80% of the planet, and then you've got the core inside. Right? So if you think of the earth like an apple, or even a peach might be a little bit better, you've got the skin of the peach, that's kind of the crust in the lithosphere. The mantle is the flesh of the peach, and then you've got this core, right, in the center, the pit. So schematically, we're looking at stuff that's in this orange, but not even all of that orange. If we blow that up, the crust of the oceans and the continents has a little bit of mantle connected to it, and most of that is about 100 kilometers thick. Sometimes a little bit more, usually a little bit less. Now, 100 kilometers is not that far, especially in Canada. A long, big country. But 100 kilometers down is substantial. We have never successfully drilled through the crust of the earth. Nowhere have we ever penetrated to the mantle. It's a whole other fun talk about how we actually then know what's down there. We have very good reason to know what's there, but still, this is a thick unit, but it's as thick to the earth as the skin of the apple is to an apple. It's really this kind of paper-thin crust. But these things are moving. And there's about a dozen very large plates on the planet, and then there are scores and scores of smaller plates. We happen to be right kind of in the middle of the North American plate. And that North American plate includes both the continental material that we stand on, and it also includes the oceanic crust that goes all the way out to the middle of the Atlantic. And there we have a break at what's called the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, and then on the opposite side of that ridge and that break, you get into the Eurasian or the African plates. Okay? So we got about a dozen of these big ones, and they're shifting around a little bit. Now that was not always obvious to people, and it's not obvious to us right now, because do you feel like you're moving? I mean, I'm a decent speaker, but I don't think I've moved you yet, right? It's not that. By the way, the jokes in this class are like getting ramen noodles from like Costco or Sam's Club, okay? There's a lot of them, but it's ramen noodles, and they're not good. In the end, there's nothing really wholesome about them. There's just volume, okay? You're gonna walk out like, I can taste the MSG from that. That was weird. So, some patterns. How is it that scientists discovered that we are actually moving on this earth when it doesn't feel like we are? Well, it doesn't feel like we are because it's happening really, really slowly, but even still, there had to be an argument that this was the case. So there are certain features on the Earth's surface that indicate very strongly that the continents have not always been in the same spot. This was worked out particularly well by German geologist Alfred Wegener. He's actually a meteorologist with some geology training. But his ideas were very incomplete and resulted in people avoiding his ideas and his conclusion of continental drift for a very long time until some new evidence came along and made some sense out of it. But some of the arguments that Wegener put together, he was not the only one to do so. In fact, there were people earlier in time who were kind of forgotten by science. So the continents seem to fit together, right? If you've ever spun the world and said, the Lord, he might make me a missionary here, right? You can notice at some point that South America and Africa kind of looked like they could go together. It really seems kind of weird. Or that the Arabian Peninsula, you just kind of want to nudge right back over into Africa, right? It seems like there are parts of the earth that look like they kind of fit together. So we refer to this as the fit of the continents. There's also, not only that, but if you put the continents, kind of push them back together again, North America next to Africa a little bit, and next to Europe, well, it turns out that some of the picture parts of the puzzle pieces match up as well. The mountain belts of the east coast of North America, the Appalachian Mountains, look like they fit pretty well next to the Scottish Highlands and the Scandinavian Mountains and the Atlas Mountains of Morocco. Otherwise, they're just a couple of disparate places. But if you put them back together, then they kind of form a nice linear trend. And in science, linear trends are great. It means that something worked in your data. You might not have any idea why or what the relationship is, but lines are important. There's also similar fossils across the Atlantic Ocean. That if you take these continents, you put them back together again, you find that there are certain fossils that now kind of overlap in range, whereas before you've got things that are on very different continents separated by oceans, and you're wondering how did they get there? And also we have things like the locations of earthquakes and volcanoes. This was something that would come later after Wegener, as we developed more and more seismic sensing capabilities in the 1940s and 1950s. So if we, again, put those continents back together again, there's the Appalachians going all the way up through Nova Scotia, the Atlas Mountains of Morocco are right next door, and then we've got the Scottish Highlands and the Scandinavian Mountains. Okay, pretty neat. Pretty neat. Now, one of the reasons that Wegener's idea was not entirely accepted is because while his idea could explain these, it couldn't explain the Rockies. And it didn't explain the Cascades or the Sierra Nevadas. In fact, it didn't explain 2/3 of North American geology. So American and Canadian geologists were not altogether that impressed in the end. They should have been, but there were some counters to these ideas. Here's an image of what the fossil ranges look like if you take the southern continents, you kind of put them back together again. You have a variety of animals and plants that don't swim, especially the plants. You know, just throw that out there. Lystrosaurus, I probably should have brought a little cast of its skull. The skull is about this big. The whole animal is about the size of a, I don't know, German Shepherd or so. And it's kind of one of the most unfortunate looking creatures I've ever seen. It's a reptilian sort of thing that's sort of like a mammal, but it has only 2 teeth that are tusks, and it ate plants. And it's kind of like a pig mated against a, I don't know, turtle. It's just really sad. It's really sad. And if you take a pig and you mate it with a turtle, you end up with an animal that does not swim at all. And yet it's found, fossils of Lystrosaurus are found in Africa and India and even in Antarctica, separated by thousands of kilometers of oceans. But if you put the continents back together again, it's kind of in this contiguous land space. And so Wegener was the one to come up with this concept of Pangea, this idea that all the continents were together in one landmass to explain these different types of features. But as I said, geologists rejected this because, well, they thought, well, maybe there were land bridges that could connect these, or yes, the plants don't swim, but their pollen can be distributed by the air and by ocean currents or things like that. So maybe there's other ways to explain this without moving continents around, because after all, we're not moving. Can't feel it, can't detect it. This is the distribution of major earthquakes in the world over the course of the 20th century. This is a diagram from the United States Geological Survey. And we're sitting over here in northern Ontario, which as an American I thought northern Ontario was like way up here, but you guys have a different term for it, I guess. And as you can see, there's nothing going on in northern Ontario. Now, maybe there's nothing going on in northern Ontario, period, but geologically speaking, I don't get boos in the States on that one, sorry. But geologically speaking, you're in a very quiet area. There's no volcanoes, there's no big, earthquakes. Here, where I come from in Virginia, boring geology. That's why I live there. Think of where geologists live. The ones that have long lives live over here. The guys who die early, they're just, But this distribution of earthquakes and volcanoes, if we mapped it over top, would almost perfectly match. This is not random. Right? This is not just a random association of stuff. There are clear patterns to where the earthquakes and where the volcanoes happen to be. plate tectonics starts to give us a reason for why, whereas in a static continent world, you're left with, I don't know why we've got volcanoes all along the western side of South America and nowhere on the eastern, or the other 3/4 of the continent. Why is it that Africa has nothing going on except for a couple of earthquakes and volcanoes right around, the eastern flank of it? So we've got some patterns to explain here. So it turns out that not only is there evidence that the continents have been moving around, but there also is evidence that the ocean floor itself has moved. And this was something that helped turn the tables back in Wegener's favor as his idea of continental drift was eventually merged with what we call seafloor spreading. So a couple of bits of evidence for this is that we have very large volcanic mountain ridges inside the ocean that nobody had ever seen before, unless they were dropped there by a mafioso guy. They didn't kind of send a report back up. That was kind of the end of it all. There's also magnetic reversals that seem to be recorded in the lava flows of the bottom of the ocean. Everywhere you go in the ocean, in the deep parts of the ocean, ultimately the rock is made up of something called basalt. Geologists even have a name for it. They call it MORB, mid-ocean ridge basalt. It doesn't matter if you're in the Pacific or the Indian or the Atlantic Ocean, the composition of the crust is identical in every space. Once you kind of get off the continent and the continent drops off, you get into this basalt lava flow that is the ocean floor. And within that ocean floor are changes in the magnetic signature. Sometimes, and if you think about, where's north, I'm just going to point to the clock. That's north most of the time, but occasionally north switches and north is actually that way. It's south. And in geology, what can happen is when a new lava is being erupted, there's little magnetic mineral grains inside there, and those little magnetic mineral grains will swing towards the north, and as the lava cools, they get locked in, they get stuck. And then if the lava gets moved, they just kind of move along with it, right? Because they're stuck in the solid rock. Well, sometimes when we have these reversals, the magnetic mineral grains, well, they flip, they point the other way. And so this was entirely unexpected. It was first discovered in terrestrial lava flows by volcanoes, but then it was mapped in the oceans as well. So if we drained all the water out of the oceans, we'd die. But if we could do that without dying and take a look, we'd see that there's these big ridges. And these are where the lava seems to be pouring forth. And it was an American naval operator by the name of Harry Hess. He worked with submarines during World War II, became a rear admiral for the US Navy, and he started putting together a whole bunch of data about the ocean bottom because he had access to sonar data. And that was something, sonar was only invented in the 1920s and was put to big use, especially during World War II and the immediate post-Cold War era. And so Harry Hess had data of what the oceans looked like. And he's like, there is a seam on our continent that's like like a baseball. And I can follow this thing all over the place. And then there are places where there are huge, deep ocean trenches. And those trenches tend to be found next to continental areas or island areas that are volcanic. And all those volcanoes and earthquakes are associated with these places where either we've got these big mountains that are volcanic, or we have these trenches that are forming big mountains that are also volcanic. Something's connecting these things together. So there's good evidence that the ocean floor has moved and that the continents have moved, and that we can rearrange the continents, certainly to Pangaea, and then also it looks like there are arrangements prior to that that are a little bit different. So this tells me that when God first created the world looked different. I mean, you look at this and say, I don't know where North America is. Well, I do, I'm the geologist, but nonetheless, right, I look at it, this is not the modern world. This is one conception of maybe the way the world might have looked at the beginning of creation. So in the 1990s, a group of creation researchers said, you know what, the evidence for plate tectonics is extraordinarily compelling. It's all circumstantial, right? It's all based on the outcrops and the geology that we have, but it becomes very hard to explain the world's geology if the continents are not moving, and it becomes very easy to explain the geology if they are moving. So, inference to the best explanation, the continents and the ocean floor is moving. And the creation geologists, with people like my friend Dr. Steve Austin, if you watch the movie Is Genesis History, you get a sense of some of my friends in this. Dr. Kurt Wise was involved, Andrew Snelling, Larry Vardaman, a number of others, and the computer modeling was done by Dr. John Baumgartner, a geophysicist. And what they discovered was, what Baumgartner's, especially his work showed, was that plate tectonics could actually happen very, very quickly. Right now, we're looking at a couple of centimeters a year for the movement of North America drifting slightly to the west, maybe 5-6 kilometers a year. It's not much. But given the right initial conditions, we can end up having a flood that actually moves these continents at rates of kilometers per hour. And if North America is moving at, say, 6 kilometers an hour, that doesn't seem very fast. Unless you're North America, right? In which case, actually, you're trucking. This is moving really quick, and Africa's like, hey, I want to meet you, right? And things are going to happen, right? So what we think in this idea of what we call catastrophic plate tectonics is that the flood began with the onset of what we call subduction. Subduction is when ocean crust goes underneath continental crust or another piece of ocean crust. And that happens because ocean crust is relatively dense compared to the continents. The reason that the continents sit up is because they're thick and they're light. They're kind of like icebergs of rock. Whereas the ocean floor is made up of basalt, which is about 10 to 15% more dense. So it sits down a little bit lower. It's also thinner. So the reason the oceans are where they are is because you have thin, dense rock in one place, and the land is someplace because you have thick, lighter rock in others. Okay, and so at the beginning of the flood, we think that there was a crack that developed that started the process of bringing this ocean floor down into the mantle. If ocean crust is cold enough, and it is in a few places in the world here, it's actually more dense than the mantle below, which is unusual. But that imbalance, that kind of teetering on an unstable situation, is what allows plate tectonics to initiate during Noah's flood. Now, I don't know the event that started that. I don't know if it was meteorites. I don't know if it was God slamming the door of the ark. Right? The onset of that event is something that is, I think, outside of what we can see, based on what we still have today, the relics, the geological relics of the event. So this ends up creating a runaway feedback mechanism. Now, Genesis 7 tells us that there are two sources of water for Noah's flood. One is called the fountains of the great deep, and the other is the windows of heaven. I don't consider these to be terribly technical terms. Right? Windows of heaven is a Hebrew euphemism for rain. A lot of rain fell out of the sky. And it's not that there's actually angels up there like, open the windows, right? And the stuff came out. You will hear skeptics who will say things like that. Skeptics will say, oh, the ancient Israelites, they had a conception. Windows is actually sluice gates because it's like an irrigation canal, and technically that's really what it is. It's the sluice gate. But we have to allow the Hebrews to have, idioms, right? If you were talking to a friend and somebody recorded this conversation and centuries later somebody was studying the language of Canadians and they saw that somebody said that it was raining cats and dogs, you kind of hope that they're going to cut you a little slack, right? And if you're not, they're going to think that you have this very unusual view of the hydrologic cycle that's evaporating small mammals and precipitating them someplace else, right? Boy, they thought weird things. No, the Israelites did not believe that there were actual angels who were holding the sluice gates of heaven. They had a euphemism, a phrase. Windows of heaven meant that it started raining a whole bunch. So the windows of heaven were open. The fountains of the great deep seems that there's something in the earth. The deep is the Hebrew word tehom. It means deep waters. It also means the deep part of the earth. It's kind of a place where you go that you don't come back. It's deep. Scary sort of stuff. Both of these, we believe in creation geology, are caused ultimately by the ocean ridges in the process of catastrophic plate tectonics. So I'm not a good motivational speaker, so this is what I have. I've got 4 awful steps to flood the world, right? And we'll see a schematic image that will help to flesh these out a little bit. When God closed the door to the ark, the next thing that we see is, the time for grace has ended, the time of judgment has begun, and the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of heaven were opened. That's the phrase there, so it seems like there's one and the other, they start going off. So there seems to be 4 ways in which the waters of the oceans can be pumped over the land. If we scrubbed the world and made everything nice and even, we'd have about 2 to 3 kilometers worth of water over everything. So in the world right now, there is enough water to flood the world easily if things are kind of even. But things aren't even. We've got land and we've got ocean. So what we need to do is kind of see if God is rebalancing these during the flood. How is that happening? So one is that as we have massive eruptions that start in the middle of the ocean ridge, these create gigantic geysers, plumes of water that radiate out into the atmosphere and come down as this geshem. That's the Hebrew word that is used for the rain in the Genesis flood. It's used elsewhere in the Old Testament. A good comparison for a modern day term for this is probably downpour. So I think that there was probably rain before the flood. God talks in Genesis chapter 2 that there wasn't yet rain on the earth, but that's because there wasn't any plants, because there weren't any people yet. By the end of Genesis 2, that's all fixed. There's agriculture and people, so it's probably raining. But we don't get a weather report in the next several chapters. God's got other things to do. All right, we passed through 1,600 years of Earth history in one genealogy. It's pretty brief. And so the first time that we actually see rain mentioned again in the Bible is this word geshem, which is less frequent in the Old Testament and probably has this connotation of a downpour. Second, the subduction, the sinking of the ocean crust into the mantle, actually causes the continents at the edges of them to get dragged and pulled downward. And this is one of the more substantial components of the modeling that shows us what would happen in a plate tectonics catastrophic flood sort of situation. Because while geologists talk about plates sliding back and forth, what we really mean is grinding. This is rock on rock. This is not smooth. There's no lubrication oils. There's no WD-40 going on here. You've got rock that's grinding against rock, and as that happens, the friction helps to pull the continents down by about 1 kilometer. That's a lot, because that's 1 kilometer of distance that allows 1 kilometer of water to rise over the continent. So where I'm at in Lynchburg, Virginia, totally underwater if we're thinking about a modern geography. Points 3 and 4. 3 is also important. 2 and 3 are the biggest here. In 3, the new ocean crust is as that crust is cracking and sinking in some areas, it's being replaced by new magma at these ocean ridges. The reason that we've got these big, huge mountain belts from one end of the ocean to the other is because we have lava coming up to fill the void of the crack. And the only difference between me and my secular colleagues who train me is the pace that we think that this happens. We recognize that there are big magma plumes. We can detect these with seismic imagery and approaches. And we've got earthquakes and volcanoes and active lava that's happening there. So as this new magma starts hitting the bottom of the world's oceans, it starts vaporizing water in a big way, sending it out into the atmosphere and pluming things down. But also, the new magma itself is actually thicker than the old stuff that is going away. So the old stuff that's being dragged down into the mantle is cold, it's thin, it's creation weak material. This is thick, new warm magma, and what that does is it raises the bottom of the bathtub. And if you get into a nice bathtub and you're up to your neck in the bubbles, I'm just really enjoying it. Like, the girls look at me and smile on that one. The guys are like, keep talking. But a mischievous cousin has put a little inflatable raft on the bottom of your tub, and you didn't realize it. And they click that in the other room, and all of a sudden, it goes up, right? The water is forced up and out of the bathtub because the bottom of the bathtub is higher than it used to be. The volume is different. Well, if you were Earth, there is no edge to the bathtub. So as the bathtub bottom starts to raise with the new magma, the water simply just goes higher and higher and higher and higher. And we get this account in Genesis chapter 7 of 150 days in which the waters are just continually rising and prevailing like an army overwhelming the land. And they stay up there for a good long time, such that by day 224, Noah finally sees some mountains. So they have been persisting in their destruction of the world, either from day 140 or day 150 to day 224. It's a little unclear in the Hebrew when we reach the peak of Noah's flood. So schematically, these are some of the things that are going on. We've got this new magma that's coming up here, vaporizing water, creating massive amounts of rainfall. We have new ocean crust that is thicker than the old stuff, so you can see that blue strip. That's where there's still old ocean crust that's going down and subducting. This subduction is dragging down the continents, and all of this is changing the elevation by a couple of kilometers, easily able to inundate all the high hills under the whole heavens by the time that we get towards the end of Genesis chapter 7. Genesis chapter 8 begins with one simple verse. It says, "And God remembered Noah." And that is actually the most important verse of the entire flood narrative. The whole flood narrative is actually built in a Hebrew construction called a chiasm. I won't talk too much about that, but it basically means a balanced story, where you see events, people, numbers, phrases that are used, and then they're mirrored on the backside. So you see that Noah is given 7 days warning before the flood comes out. When he leaves, he waits 7 days before he exits the ark. There's a 40-day period of intense rainfall. There's a 40-day period mentioned on the other side. There's 150 days leading up to the pinnacle of the flood. That 150 is mentioned again on the other side of this chiasm. But right in the middle of the chiasm, the hinge verse for all of it is, God remembered Noah. You get the sense, reading through Genesis chapter 7, and I'd encourage you to read it afresh, that if God did not remember Noah, Noah would not have made it either. The fact that Noah survives the ark and the flood is a miracle. The flood itself is a miracle, and the fact that Noah actually still survived it despite making and being faithful, it's because he was faithful that God remembered. Not like, wait, where'd he go? Right? The whole world's full of water. Where'd the boat go? Right? No, it's not that kind of remember. This is the remembering that is done when God enacts a promise that he has made. So God remembers the faithfulness of Noah. He fulfills his promise to see Noah through the flood, and Noah receives a blessing as a result. Right? So at day 150, that's what happens. By that point, it seems that probably a lot of the old pre-flood ocean crust is now subducted, and the newer stuff that's thicker resists going down because it's lighter, it's more buoyant, it likes being up on the top of the planet, it doesn't like getting dragged down so much, and the cooling of the ocean water starts to pull back. The lack of subduction causes the friction to end, and the continents start to rise back up again. Because they're like icebergs. They want to float, but you've pulled them down a little, they bob back up, the mountains show up. So when we're thinking about what things looked like, at the beginning of creation, the continental arrangement could have looked something like this. This is what we in geology refer to as rodinia. This is a series of the continents in an arrangement probably, on the conventional time scale, about 700 million years ago. We would consider something like that the arrangement of the creation week material a few thousand years ago. That means that Pangaea is actually formed. The evidence that Wegener saw, the evidence that Harry Hess saw, Pangaea is actually formed during Noah's flood and broken. So Pangaea is not the way that God made the world. There's evidence that Pangaea itself has to be assembled. That's why we have the Appalachians. They happen because North America and Africa collide with one another and bend and break pre-existing rocks that have fossils in them. So we've got flood-based early fossils that are then crumbled and broken when Pangaea forms, and then the last thing that happens is Pangaea splits, and this is the easier part to track because the puzzle pieces fit easier. So the stuff back over here is harder to figure out because the puzzle pieces have extra puzzle pieces that are on the backside of them and you're not sure where they go all the time. So what catastrophic plate tectonics does is it answers quite a few questions. It answers that question of where the water came from and where it goes. The water to flood the world was actually in the oceans of the world at that time. And by the time the flood is over, those waters have peeled back to new ocean basins. But it's the same world. I don't think that there was a miraculous source of water, but there was miraculous activity in initiating and seeing the flood as an event. There's some important predictions that catastrophic plate tectonics makes and has been confirmed because as a scientific theory, it's got to be able to not only explain the data that we have, but also make some expectations about what we would find if we were to look further into things. One is the fact that if we have these magnetic reversals that happen when the magma freezes during periods when north and south are flipping, this would have to happen very quickly because there's dozens and dozens of these recorded in the rocks, hundreds actually, and if this is formed mostly during Noah's flood, then these flips would have to happen in days, hours sometimes. And also the existence of cold pre-flood crust. The modeling done by Dr. John Baumgartner showed this crust going all the way down towards the core of the Earth. It couldn't go into the core. The core is way too dense, too heavy. It's made entirely of iron. And so the old pre-flood ocean crust would subduct it, go down, and then kind of like bounce and stay near the core. So I'll show just a brief image of that one as I'm just about out of time. But this is a wireframe diagram. This is the Earth On the exterior, the ball in the center represents the core of the Earth, and I wish I had the colored version of this one. But over here, this light color is red hot material that seems to be migrating upward, and then wrapping around the core would normally be in blue here, but these are big, huge, cold slabs, cold, dense stuff that happens to be near the core. Now, the reason that's important for catastrophic plate tectonics is because if the Earth's history is young and the flood happened only a few thousand years ago, there hasn't been enough time for the old ocean crust to warm up. Even though it's in the mantle, and the deeper parts of the mantle, it's extraordinarily hot down there. The thing is, rock is a really good insulator. It doesn't heat up very easily at all. It doesn't cool down very easily at all. It pretty much stays the temperature that it is. If, on the other hand, plate tectonics is a process that has taken hundreds of millions of years, between Pangaea even and today, or even deeper in time, then there's been plenty of time for thick slabs of rock to equilibrate with the temperature of the lower mantle. The fact that there seems to be these big temperature differentials is a good confirming bit of evidence that catastrophic plate tectonics is on the right track. So we seem to have some sort of plate graveyard down over here. That's pretty cool. Now, the last thing I want to leave you with here is recognizing the judged world is then different. The world that we live in is the world that has been judged and seen its way through the flood. Now, what I think is amazing about God's design of this world is that it survived the flood. We live on a tremendously robust planet. Doesn't mean we can't mess it up, but we can't destroy it. God told us that he was going to destroy the world that was, and he did, and we now live in a world that is slightly different. Because of the flood, new mountain ranges existed that never existed before. The Appalachian Mountains were not prior to the flood. The Himalayas, the Rockies, are not mountain ranges that existed prior to the flood. So if a skeptic says, well, in order to flood the world, you got to cover Mount Everest, and Mount Everest is 28,000 feet. There's not enough water in the world to do that. I can say, you're right, there's not enough water to cover Mount Everest. It's a good thing it wasn't there, because it wasn't. Mount Everest is a product of the tectonic movements that happened, and one of the reasons why Everest is as big as it is it started forming towards the later part of the flood. The Appalachians are small because they started forming early and were still beaten up and eroded during the later portions of Noah's flood. But the Rockies, the Alps, the Himalayas, they're young, very young. So that was then, and this is now. These worlds are very, very different. And if we had time to talk about paleontology, we'd be looking at the ecologies here are tremendously different between then and now. And because of the flood, geological disasters today are relatively common. Just a couple of weeks ago, there was a big earthquake that resulted in a tsunami in Indonesia, and last time I saw the news, 1,200 people were dead. And the number is probably going to be a bit higher than that, right? This is a picture of the tsunami that hit Japan in 2011. Many of you remember that, the one that damaged the nuclear power plant at Fukushima Daiichi. We're still dealing with the consequences of that. I was just finishing a series of lectures on earthquakes and volcanoes, and then we went on spring break, and it was right before spring break that this happened. So this was very fresh in my mind as I was teaching it, and then I got to watch in real time a tsunami overwhelming the Sendai province of Japan. And that event hit me in a strange way, because later on that week, I watched the disaster movie 2012. It's okay. It's not bad. But I had a hard time generating joy in a movie that was showing the destruction of humanity. And before this, I like disaster films, right? They're cheesy and silly, but they're kind of fun. And as a geologist, I get to poke fun at what they're doing geologically, and sometimes they're good and sometimes they're not. I couldn't derive any joy out of 2012 because I had just witnessed what a real tsunami does. But one of the things that movies like 2012 or Pompeii or things like that can do is they can give us an idea of what disaster looks like. And 2012 in particular has a whole bunch of themes involving Noah's flood in it. They build boats that they call the Ark, for crying out loud. Right? They're putting animals on board it. And they're worried that the entire world is going to be destroyed with this. There's all sorts of biblical imagery here. And that movie did a really good job of computer modeling things that as I look at it, I go, it might have looked something like that. So while I have trouble now from these real events enjoying a disaster film, I can also appreciate that the disaster films can get us a window and a glimpse of what was mentioned last night by Logan, of the true myth. That we have these, our movies are our modern mythologies, but they are speaking to those things that are true. A disaster in which people are saved through the righteous actions of a person is a common theme because it's real. And it was real because of Noah and God. And the good news is that that judgment, that destruction of the world that happened, that Mabul, is promised to never happen again. When Noah's off of the boat, God enacts the very first stated covenant. This is the first time that God says, I will establish a covenant with you. It's before Abraham. And he says, never again will all life be cut off by the waters of a flood, the Mayim of the Mabul. Never again will there be a Mabul to destroy the earth. I've set my rainbow in the clouds. They will be a sign of a covenant between me and the earth, not just us, the earth. Never again will the waters become a Mabul to destroy all life. If the earth is ancient, then this Mabul as described in Genesis never happened, because there's no point in geology where you can say this one layer was all Noah's flood. I think you have to look at a lot of layers. If you see a lot of layers, you see the flood. But if the flood was just a local event that affected Mesopotamia, then I don't really know that God has kept that promise. Because there's been a lot of floods that have destroyed a lot of life, and you can't get a global flood that destroys all of humanity in a localized spot. Humans are far too diverse, they're all over the planet, and human biogeography does not frustrate God's attempt at judgment. We can't go far enough to avoid him, neither his judgment nor his love. So with that, I thank you very much. We are at the break time, and so I'll hand it back over to our host. And thank you all very much. Appreciate it.